All right, guys, we all pull out your Bibles, and we're going to be in Numbers chapter 20 tonight. So we actually skipped a few chapters. Last week we spent our time in Numbers chapter 17. Y'all kind of recap that for me. What was going on in Numbers chapter 17? If you can reach way back in your memory to that point in time.
Aaron's rod?
Yeah, so we get sort of the end of this confirmation of Aaron's priesthood. He stops this plague that had been going on, and then God proposes this strange test. He says, hey, y'all stick, all the tribal chiefs, you stick your rod there in the sanctuary, and whoever is the real high priest, I'm going to make his rod bud. And as Richard said, Aaron's rod is the one that buds, and so God has chosen Aaron. And so that's kind of where we left things, and we discussed not only the fact that Aaron was a wonderful high priest for the Israelites, but that we have an even better high priest, right? That Jesus is an even better high priest for us than Aaron was for them. So tonight we're going to be in Numbers 20. And Numbers 20 marks a turning point in the story of ancient Israel, both literally and figuratively. They had been sentenced, right, to wander for 40 years in the wilderness because of their sin. And so tonight we're going to see is that period in their history, the period of wandering, draws to a close, and they start to turn towards the promised land again, and also to a new generation who is going to take up the mantle. So let me just quickly summarize where we've been in Numbers. So at the beginning, God's people arrive on the border of the promised land, right? And God gets them all organized to go in and take the land. He takes a census of the fighting men. He sets up the camp. They send spies into the land to check it out. And the spies come back and they say, I don't think we can do this. They got cities with big walls. The people are huge. And so the people let fear overwhelm their faith, and they choose not to pursue this course of action. And in punishment for that, God says, okay, you don't want to go into the promised land, you won't. You're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and every one of you who did not have faith in me is going to die before you can go into the promised land. So as they've wandered, we've seen some rebellions, right? The people have rebelled against God's leadership, Moses and Aaron. And God has demonstrated His approval of Moses and Aaron over and against anybody who would challenge them. So tonight in chapter 20, we're actually going to witness a different kind of rebellion than we've seen so far. Who has started all of the rebellions thus far in Numbers? The people have. But tonight, if you read ahead, who's going to rebel in the text tonight? The leadership. Right, this is going to be a different sort of a beast than we have encountered so far. So would somebody begin reading for us? Actually, let's just read Numbers chapter 20, verse 1. Would somebody do that?
And the people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month. And the other people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there.
Okay, what's significant in verse 1? Miriam dies. Now in Numbers, this is almost just given to us like a footnote, right? It's just a bare statement of fact. The people came to Kadesh and Miriam died. Do y'all think it was more significant than that to the people of Israel when it happened? Y'all are nodding your heads yes. Why do you think it was significant? Yeah, she was part of the leadership. We read earlier in Exodus, where she celebrates publicly. She sings a song of praise. We're also told that she was a prophetess, right? And then I think I heard Becky Schramm say, not only is she in the leadership, she's got an important relation. She's Moses' sister, right? And, yes, that's right, and Aaron's sister. And so she's a very significant person. And I want to suggest that there's even more to it than this. The people would have heard God say, all of you, all the adults, who rebelled against me are going to die in the wilderness. And I think to some extent they would have believed God, and they would have seen people around them beginning to die through these 40 years. But then Miriam dies. And the thought was probably, whoa, if even Miriam is facing this fate, I'm going to die as well, right? This punishment is for me too. If even someone like Miriam is going to pass away because of the judgment of God, this is coming for me as well. And so I imagine in many ways this was a shock to the people of Israel. And then there's one more thing here. Miriam's death is actually a literary signal in the Old Testament that things are changing. In Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, there are three, we call them travel logs, three journeys that happen. The first one is the period of travel from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. And it begins with Moses and Miriam singing this triumphant song of victory, right? The second period of travel was from Sinai to Kadesh, and it begins, we actually studied this together, not with a song of victory, but with Miriam complaining against Moses, right? And then here we have the third period of travel, which is from Kadesh to the Promised Land. It doesn't begin with a song from Miriam. It doesn't begin with a complaint from Miriam. It begins with what? The death of Miriam. And so this is a signal for us as readers that things are changing, right? This pattern, although it's being continued in some ways, is being broken in some ways. Something new is about to happen. All right, let's read this next section. Somebody begin reading in Numbers chapter 20, verse 2. And if you would, read for us through verse 9.
Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this desert, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs or grapevines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink." You want me to keep going?
Yes, ma'am, if you'd go through verse 9.
Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together and speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out water. And you will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink." So they speak to the rock.
And then verse 9, Becky, if you would.
So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him.
Thank you.
He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" And then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff, and water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank.
All right, so we've got, man, there's a lot to unpack here. So first of all, does this story sound familiar to you? Yes, it does, right? Where have we heard this before?
And some do.
That's so good. Yeah, okay. Fair enough. Becky literally gave the Sunday school answer, right? Usually we say that's Jesus, but in this case, Becky went even farther. So we have heard this story in Exodus, almost to the precise, minute detail. This story happens in Exodus chapter 17. So like Miriam's involvement in all three travel episodes, there's some sort of problem, some sort of complaint with either food or water. Now in the past, in these other two episodes, How have we seen God provide for the people in the case of food and in the case of water? Okay, so the manna, right? When the people cry out and say, we have no food, God sends them manna and He sends them quail, right? And then what happens the first time with water and the rock? What does God do?
He tells Moses to strike the rock.
And John, when Moses hits the rock with his staff, what happens?
Water goes from the rock.
And the people have water, right? So we've seen this before. This time, though, things are different. This is, I'll admit, one of the more difficult passages in the Old Testament to understand and to grasp when you read it. In fact, I have a dear friend who is doing his PhD on this passage, trying to understand what's going on. But I actually think that you and I can come to a pretty good understanding of this tonight. So first of all, I think it's important for us to note, do the Israelites have a real problem, or are they just sort of grumbling complainers? It's a real problem. Linda, why is it a real problem? There's no water. And what happens if you and I don't drink water? We will die. It's a real issue that they have. Now, what should they have done to solve this problem? They should have asked. They should have prayed, right? Lord, we have this real problem. You know that we have it. Would you provide for us? And given their experience over the last 40, 50, 60 years, they would have known, right, that God is going to answer this prayer. He will provide. He has done it so many times before. But they don't do that. Instead of asking or praying, what do? They grumble and complain, okay? Now, Moses and Aaron actually respond to this well at first. What do Moses and Aaron do when the people complain? Yeah, they go out to the tent of meeting where God is. They fall on their face, and just like we saw last week, they're falling on their face to intercede, right? They don't want God to wipe the people out because of their grumbling and complaining. So they start really well. And God appears to Moses and Aaron, and He gives them a set of instructions. And I want us to look really carefully through this set of instructions. What's the first thing God tells Moses and Aaron to do? I'm looking at verse 8. Take the staff. Now, which staff can we assume or guess at that God is talking about? I heard two answers, and these are the two options. It's either Moses' staff, which would be the one that was used last time, or it's Aaron's staff. Now, what's the argument one way or the other?
They took the staff from the president's stuff.
So it would seem, right, that probably what is meant, although we can't be sure, is Aaron's staff, right? The one that just budded a few chapters ago. So take that staff. What's the second thing they're supposed to do? Okay, get everybody together, all the people who need water, right? And then you and Aaron are, this is very, very important. What are Moses and Aaron to do? Speak to the rock. Okay? What were they supposed to do last time in Exodus 17? Strike the rock. Okay? Now let's see what they do. Becky read this for us already. If we begin looking in verse 10, y'all listen, and we want to check this off one at a time. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together. So far, so good? Yep, doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Before the rock, and he said to them, now we're already getting off the rails a little bit. Did God instruct Moses to speak to the people? Now who is he supposed to talk to? The rock. Okay, so we're off the rails a little bit. Here's what he says. Listen to this. He said to them, "Hear now, you rebels." Can y'all hear the tone? I'm not doing it quite angry enough, but you can imagine the way he said this. "Shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. We got at least 3 problems with the way this works out, okay? Here's the first one. Moses and Aaron, what's the tone, what's the mood in their address to the people? It's anger. Frustration. Do they have a right to be angry and frustrated? Yes. Because we're on y'all, just in our study together over the last year, we're on the 50th or 70th time that this has happened, right? And we can be sure that Moses didn't record all of the times that the people complained, right? Something he dealt with every day. He has every right to be frustrated. However, what kind of response do we see God have when Moses and Aaron go out to the tent of meeting? Does he express any frustration? Any anger? Did God have a right to be frustrated and angry? Yes. But he doesn't express it. There's not a hint of it here. Nothing. God says, yeah, I'm going to give the people water. Here's how I'm going to do it. Here's what you're going to do. It's grace, right? So here's the problem. Moses and Aaron, whose job is to go between God and the people, to be the mediator and the priest, they express frustration and anger with the people when God does not. It's not appropriate, right? It's out of place. It's out of context. And in that sense, they had no right to do this. God came down in grace, and yet His servants go out in anger, right? That's the first thing. Second, there's a really small but very important word. It's a 2-letter word that happens in verse 8. Look at this. Or sorry, not verse 8, verse 10. Hear now, you rebels, shall... Why is that word important? Who's bringing the water out of the rock? Not Moses and Aaron. And so they are grabbing credit for themselves that is due only to God. They can't bring water out of rocks. Y'all can go home and try this today if you'd like. Find you a nice stick. Like a stick you would have been happy to play with when you were a kid. Find you a nice rock. You can beat that thing till the cows come home. No water's coming out of it. This is not something that they can do, and yet they take this credit for themselves. Are we going to have to do this for you again? You rebels, right? Finally, and actually let me say this as well. God says as much in verse 12. Y'all look at verse 12. You did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people. They didn't uphold God. Who did they uphold? Themselves, right? Last thing, and y'all have already caught this. I heard you say it. Moses and Aaron don't speak to the rock. They strike it, okay? Now, why? Well, we're not exactly sure. We're not told why this takes place. But the point is, they were not strictly obedient to the instructions of God. God told them to speak to the rock, not strike it. And there's an omission here, something that the author of Numbers leaves out that we should be clued into. We've probably read 100 times in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers these words, and Moses did as the Lord commanded. Do you see them here? It's a screaming omission because essentially for the first time, Moses does not do as the Lord commanded. One interesting note I read this afternoon, again, credit to Matthew Henry. Who wrote Numbers? What credit to Moses in some sense that this story's here, right? He put this down at his own expense, right, for us to learn from. I think that's an interesting observation. Now, what are we supposed to learn from this? What do y'all think? Why did Moses put this story in here? What are you and I, some thousands of years later, supposed to learn from this story about Moses and Aaron and a rock? Obedience. And Richard, say a little more about that. What kind of obedience?
Obedience to God. To adhere to His word.
Yes. To adhere to His word, Richard said, right? So God has spoken. And we're to do as we've been told, right? To do as he spoke to us. And here we see, right, very carefully what he said. Not the way we did it last time or whatever, but very careful obedience, right? Jenny?
Kind of gives me a picture of something I see that Hollywood puts up, like a movie of just a runaway preacher. Kind of, hey, you heathens!
Yeah, right?
Do you want water? What? And gets the people all around it, yeah, we want water. And then it becomes all about themselves.
Right.
And then they say, do you want, us to, we will bring the water out.
Yes.
And then I think it was just, he tapped the rock because he'd done it before.
Yeah.
So he got caught up.
Mm.
And he wasn't paying attention.
Mm.
He was in his moment. He was just in it. And he forgot all about
What God
specific
said.
instructions of what God said. He was just doing what he had done before and assuming
Yeah.
that, of course God's going to show up because it's me. It's me, Aaron, it's me, Moses, of course he's going to do it.
Just like last time.
Which he did,
Mm-hmm.
which is where the grace is
Yes.
amazing.
Yes.
But yeah, I think it was like a moment.
That's a helpful picture, right? And I think it seems almost self-evidently true that Moses, however it happened, gets caught up in this moment. Maybe, obviously there's a selfish component to it. There's obviously a component of anger to this. But in this moment, he forgets either forgets or willfully disobeys the very careful instructions of God that he received, right? Do we do that sometimes? Oh yeah, right? It's very easy.
What you just said is that, maybe you should give him a little grace and say, he just forgot
Right.
what God said specifically, and he was carrying through, okay, sure. He was just doing it. But, I think it shows us how important God thinks the details.
Yes.
The little things,
I think,
following his word.
Yes. Carefully. Yes. Wes?
I think it's interesting, God gave them what they needed, even though they didn't follow the instructions.
Isn't that, Jenny said that too, right? That there's this beautiful picture of grace that God's chosen mediators, Moses and Aaron, disobey, and not just disobey privately, publicly, in the sight of all the congregation disobey, and yet God gives His people what they need, in spite of them. What grace. Absolutely amazing. Susan?
Most of these people aren't the original Israelites.
Right.
from Egypt.
Yes.
They don't know how to walk. They never had to repair a pair of shoes or weave material to sew a dress together. Everything is just perfect.
They've had it,
They
right?
just go out, pick up manna in the morning and before
Yeah.
no work.
They should be used to God's provision, right? At this point in time, yes.
But I also think that the mistake that Moses made was that he took credit for something that God did.
100%.
And I think that's a lesson for us is when, he took the motion that he knew that he wasn't supposed to do that, to strike. But, I think that by doing that, he was calling attention to himself and trying to make himself, I guess, big in the eyes
Yeah.
of his fellow Israelites.
Yeah.
So it's a common mistake.
Yes. My buddies, I mentioned in passing that my buddy is doing his PhD on this, and the working title for his PhD is Moses, God of Israel, ? Because the suggestion here, and this is what Oliver's getting at, right, is Moses says, in effect, don't worry about God bringing the water from the rock. I'll do this. I'm your leader, right? John? He touched glory. That's an old saying, but no. So there's so much to learn here, and I'm glad that y'all didn't say this. Y'all are tracking so well. I think we can be tempted when we read this account to draw from this that God is harsh, that God is strict. How many times have we read in these 3 books, that Moses did as the Lord commanded. We read it over and over and over again, and we're tempted to think he messes up once and he can't go in the promised land because he messed up once? What kind of God is that? And then more than that, if that's how he treated Moses, who is a much more obedient person, I imagine, than you are, and I know than I am, what hope is there for me? If Moses can't go in the promised land because he disobeyed once, what about me? The lesson here is not that God is harsh, because here's the deal, y'all. We are not being invited to compare Moses to ourselves. We're being invited to compare Moses to Christ. That's the invitation of this text. Moses was a great mediator, a wonderful mediator. For years and years and years, he went between God and His people faithfully. He did exactly as the Lord commanded. But Moses wasn't perfect. And because Moses wasn't perfect, because he messed up this one time, he was not able to lead God's people into the promised land. Now that's a problem. And you and I, when we read this text, one of the things that we're supposed to feel weigh on us is, if Moses wasn't good enough to get it done for God's people, who can lead us into the promised land?
Moses also killed somebody too.
That's right. That's right. He had a past. Yes. And so as we ponder this question, right, we realize, I need a better mediator than Moses. And we have one, right? Let me read Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 15 to you. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Jesus knows, just like Moses knew. Moses knew everything that was involved in being an Israelite, all the temptations to complain, the temptations to rebel, the temptations to stray. Moses knew what that was like. But sometimes he gave in. Jesus knows what it's like to be a human being, to be tempted to stray, to complain, to walk away from the path that the Lord has set for us. He knows, he understands it, he's been through it, but he never sinned. He never has, and he never will. And so you and I have a mediator who is actually able to lead his people through this wilderness that you and I are in this life and to the promised land. He will not mess up. He will not sin. It's not something that you and I have to stress and worry about. We have a better mediator than Moses. It is a gift of grace that has been given to us as Christians. John.
Yeah, I tend to think that if Moses had shown anger, only anger to the Israelites, Jesus showed anger as well.
Yeah.
And if he did strike the rock with the staff, I think God would have forgiven him.
And he does, for sure.
But it's the touch and the glory of
Yes.
that broke the camel's back.
Yes.
You know, I can see Moses saying, well, that's what I did last time.
I was just following the manual. Yeah, but you're right. It's the we that does it.
That's bad.
That's the big one. And I do think my buddy is on the right track with, is Moses making himself God of Israel in this moment, right? Now maybe Moses would never say that, but he touched the glory, right? Ken, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I was going to say, you're talking about Moses being punished, but how about all the people that wouldn't go into take the promised land? They never got to go in because he let them die in the desert because of that.
Yeah.
You know, they sinned against God, just like Moses did.
Yes. And so Ken, Ken is, there's a sense in which all these stories go together. So all the people have been dying because of their sin. Then we see Miriam die because of her sin. She's a leader. But now we see that Moses, the leader, is going to face the same fate. He's going to die outside the promised land because he sinned against the Lord, right? And it is this reinforcement of the point that if it happened to Moses, what about us, right? It's that point all over again.
I got questions.
Yes, sir.
Is the leadership more accountable to God than the people?
100%. And we see that. Let's look one more time at verse 12. This is what God is saying. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy, look, in the eyes of the people of Israel. This is not a private sin. This is a public sin. It's a public disgrace to the name of God that the mediators even did not uphold God as holy. You're absolutely right. And so one of the things we learn for sure, and Paul will say as much in the New Testament, right? There's a standard that's got to be held, and they don't hold it. They have for so long, but not here, right? Yes, ma'am?
Is there a significance of why you hit the rock twice?
Good question. I'm going to give Matthew Henry's answer, and then maybe Dr. Hurley has a thought. I'm putting him on the spot. But Matthew Henry sort of speculates that Moses hits it the first time, and he doesn't, wait, nothing's going, smacks it again, right? I can certainly see that. I think that's what I would do. I don't know more than that. You have any thoughts, Dr. Hurley?
Yeah. Also guesses, but the first time, it's a judgment scene. Get the elders. The people are rebels, they should be wiped out, but I'll stand in front of you on a rock, hit the rock, and blessing comes to the people. And the Christology is stunning. Who takes the blow the people had coming?
Yes.
And the grace of God is seen. Then we get here and just speak. And it'll come. So you're going to ask not the rock, and then God will bring it. So
yes.
Trusting God and honoring Him, which Moses didn't do.
Right.
And Moses gets caught up. Shall we bring it to you? So he's now not trusting God, not honoring God.
Yes.
And he hits it twice. That's even out of line with
the first time.
We don't have the elders. It's not a courtroom judgment. So he shouldn't have hit it all. He should look to the grace of God.
And he does it twice.
The two, don't know why the two, but I'm with, he's really wanting to make, hey, shall we do this for you? And he's just angry and bang, bang.
He's trying to make fetch happen, right? Yeah, and so.
Whether he watched between, I don't know, but it's really clear. I'm going to do this and show you people.
Yes.
And God said, you didn't trust me, and you didn't honor me to show me holy. And the whole discussion is, Moses, you guys took us in the wilderness. We're going to die here. What's the matter? As they're about to go in the promised land.
Right.
And then does Moses say, now I'm going to take you into the promised land?
Right.
God says, no, it doesn't work.
No, yeah.
So the rejection of trusting God to do it at exactly this point where he ought to be both the mediator and the leader.
Yes.
And God says,
doesn't work like that. Yeah.
You're not the one who's going to bring them in.
Yeah. Good question, Jenny. All right, I'm going to move fairly quickly through this next section. Will somebody read verses 14 through 21?
Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, saying, this is what your brother Israel says. You know about all the hardships that have come upon us. Our forefathers went down into Egypt and lived there for many years. The Egyptians mistreated us and our fathers, but when we cried out to the Lord, he heard our cry and sent an angel and brought us out of Egypt. Now we are here at Kadesh, a town on the edge of the territory. Please let us pass through your country. We will not go through any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway and not turn to the right or to the left until we have may not pass through here. If you try, we will march out and attack you with the sword. The Israelites replied, we will go along the main road, and if we or our livestock drink any of your water, we will pay for it. We only want to pass through on foot, nothing else. Again, they answered, you may not pass through. Then Edom came out against them with a large and powerful army. Since Edom refused to let them go through their territory, Israel turned away from them.
Thanks, John. So this is a pretty simple request. The quickest way from where the Israelites were to the border of the Promised Land was to go through this nation called Edom. Now, Edom, this group of people, was descended from Esau, and so they're kindred with the Israelites. That's why we see the letter, the request addressed brother, right? So the hope is from the Israelites, these are our kindred. They're going to let us pass through the land, and you can understand the concerns, right? This is a massive group of people. They might eat our crops, they might trample them, they might drink all our water, right? And Moses says, we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to walk along the highway, we'll be in, we'll be out, it'll be over. What does the king of Edom say? No, you're not coming through. And in fact, to make sure you don't come through, I'm going to send my army to the border to make sure you go around, right? When you're upset at Thanksgiving, think of this passage. Thank you for that, Marvin. That's great.
It wasn't like day after tomorrow we'll do this. I mean, there's a million people.
Yeah.
How long does it take? I mean,
Yeah.
that's 2 months, 3 months. They're going to be on.
Yeah, even if they go as fast as they can, it's going to take a little time, right? And so you can understand the concern. Now, I think as we think about why this is put here in Numbers chapter 20, I think we can give two answers. One of them is for sure, and that is that the people have now turned, and they're going, it's time to go back to the Promised Land, right? And so this is sort of just a statement of fact that they tried to go this way and it didn't work. They were told no. I'm going to speculate a little bit when I say this, but as I was studying this week, it occurred to me that Moses, who's the leader of Israel, who has successfully led Israel through all of their journeys thus far, has just failed. Right? He's had a massive failure in the sight of the people and of God. And then, as far as I can remember, for the first time, we're told of a failure of his to accomplish something. He asks for passage through this land, and he's told no. He fails to get it, right? Now, I'm speculating about that. He obviously does fail to get it. Whether or not that's why that's here, take it or leave it. But it is interesting to me that right after his leadership failure internally among the people, he experiences this external leadership failure as well. He can't get accomplished what he needs to. And so the people have to endure this hardship of going around the land of Edom instead of through it, right? All right, I want to look at this last section because there's a good bit to unpack here. Somebody read the end of this chapter, verses 22 through 29. This is a gut-wrenching scene. Thanks, Joan. I want to give a little color to this. Again, we're kind of just, this is related to us as fact. It's just kind of bullet points. Here's what happened. Most of you know my dad's a pastor. Most of you have met him. And so the first thing I want you to see here is that this is a family affair. Okay, 2 brothers, Moses and Aaron, and a son and nephew, Eleazar, go up the mountain together. And they've already been told what's going to happen. The 3 of you are going to go up to the mountain, but only 2 of you are coming back. Aaron's going to die. Your dad is going to die. Your brother's going to die, right? And it's more than a family affair because not only are they family, they have been through this thing that we've been reading about together. As the leadership class of the people, they have been through so much together. And now it's time, they just lost Miriam, right? The sister and aunt. And now it's time for Aaron to go. And the scene here will almost move you to tears because they get to the top and Moses has been commanded, and he obeys, take Aaron's clothes off him, the high priestly clothes, right? And put them on his son, Eleazar, because Aaron's going to die. His priesthood is over. But Eleazar is going to take it up, right? It's a gut-wrenching scene in a lot of ways. And it happens exactly as God says. They go up the mountain, Moses obeys, and Aaron dies on top of the mountain. There's only 2 of them that come down. There's actually something even more sort of heartbreaking and scary almost about this. And here's what it is. Outside of the family aspect of this, Israel is observing what's happening. And they lose the only high priest that they've ever known. And he has been not just a good, an exceptional high priest. Think of all the times, just that we have studied, when the wrath of God is kindled and ready to consume this people, and who steps in the gap? It's Aaron. He's done it over and over and over again. They have literally had their lives saved time and time again by this man, this high priest who has interceded for them. And now he's dead. He's gone. And so you know the thought occurred to them, what's going to happen to us now? Because Aaron's gone. And they knew Eleazar, they knew his son, but what they didn't know is, was he going to be as good a high priest as Aaron had been? There's no way to know, right? So they had to wonder, the next time that God's wrath is kindled, when we mess up, because we will, what's going to happen? Is Eleazar going to be able to stand in the gap the way that Aaron was? Can y'all understand that fear? Y'all understand what I'm saying? The way they must have thought. So they're watching this. What are we to learn from this? What do you guys think? When you see this scene, when you read about this, a couple thousand years later, what are we supposed to get from this? Yeah, and this is part of it, right? That we enjoy certain providences of God for a time, the ministry of someone, right? Or whatever the case may be. But things change, right? Those things change hands, and we have to accommodate ourselves to a new situation.
To pick up on that, I guess hold tight to God, but hold loosely maybe leaders or the way
Yes.
we think things should be. I was supposed to strike the rock.
Mm.
No, you weren't. You were,
Mm.
hold things and people loosely.
Yes.
But hold tight to God.
That's good, Jenny, because things change. Yeah, absolutely. Here's what I want to suggest to us tonight. Again, we're being invited not to compare Aaron to ourselves, but to Jesus. Aaron was an amazing high priest, unbelievable. Time and time again interceded for his people, the Israelites, and saved them from the wrath of God. Maybe Eleazar was going to be as good. Maybe he wasn't. They didn't know. And they had to endure this. Think about their history. Time and time again. Because did Eleazar die? And in fact, it's almost comical by the time we get to the New Testament and the trial and crucifixion of Jesus, we have several high priests at the same time, right? There were tons of these guys down through Israel's history, and so they were constantly having to deal with this. What we're invited to see in this text is we need not only a high priest who never sins, we need a high priest who never dies, so that we never have to go through this wondering of, will this one be as good as the last one? What happens when this one dies? And we have a high priest like that. Let me read to you from Hebrews chapter 7, verses 22 through 24. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. Better than what? Better than the one that we're reading about. Because the former priests were many in number, because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But He, Jesus, holds His priesthood permanently because He continues forever. He never dies, right? And so as Christians, you and I have a high priest. We know He's been good to us in the past, that He has averted God's wrath from us in the past, and we never have to wonder, what about the next high priest? Because there's never going to be another one. This Jesus that saves you from the wrath of God today is the same Jesus who will save you from the wrath of God tomorrow, the next time that you mess up. Because like me, like the Israelites, you will, right? This is not going to be the last time that you need the wrath of God averted from you, and it is the same high priest that saved you yesterday, that saves you today, that will save you tomorrow. And so this passage should be such a comfort for us. And I hope y'all see tonight that Numbers 20 is filled with sad and bad news for the Israelites, but it is filled with great and joyous news for us, because we keep reading about these tragedies that happened in the Old Covenant, the way things were, right? The Old Testament. But we've got a better high priest. We've got Jesus, who is, as Hebrews puts it, the guarantor of a better covenant. This points us to Jesus, who is both the high priest we need and the high priest that we have. It is a great encouragement to us. All right, guys, we got 10 minutes. What did we not talk about that you want to talk about, or what questions do you have from this text?
John, I guess my thought was that Moses doesn't get to go into the promised land, but the promised land is not heaven. So it's not like he does not go to heaven. He just doesn't get to go to this physical promised land.
Yes.
You can't equate the promised land with heaven.
And the interesting thing is here, right, that for the Israelites, the promised land, you're exactly right, is not heaven, right? We can very well assume that many, I don't know if I want to say most, but many of the adults who died outside the promised land had put their faith in the Lord and His future promises, and so they went to heaven. So you're right there, and yet we do get this picture throughout Scripture that we're invited to understand this life is the wilderness, right, the journeying, and heaven is the promised land. And so there's sort of a, allegorical is not the right word, but there's a typological semblance there. But for Moses, you're exactly right. God doesn't give him this temporal blessing that he certainly hoped for. But I think, we can assume that the Lord granted him eternal life because of his faith. Yes. Crossing the Jordan is a term we use for getting to heaven, right? John?
Moses does see the promise.
Yes. He's granted that, right? This gift that God gives him in grace. You're not going, but I'll let you see it, right? And in some sense, this is kind of the way we think of faith, right? Is a glimpse of the hope that we have. That's what Moses got. Yeah.
Can you imagine that 30 days of mourning when Aaron died, they had been with him 40 years.
And even longer, right?
So that's it'd be like if we had a president or something,
Yeah. Lord help us if we had a... I don't know about that. What else? What else, guys?
Well, there is hope for the Israelites because there was a succession.
Yes.
Eleazar is is his successor.
Yes. there's, hope that they were able to see publicly God has not left us without a priest, a high priest. He may not be Aaron. Maybe he was, I don't know. But we've got one. We're not alone. To Marvin's earlier point, I think, John, you're tying into that, right? That things change, but God is in the change, and He's providentially there throughout, right? He's not abandoning us just because something changes. Yeah, it's good.
And He took Aaron, but Moses comes down with Eleazar and says, this is the next one. So He didn't take both leaders.
Right.
You get the acknowledging of the transition.
Yes.
It's really nice for Eleazar.
Yes.
But, yeah, He didn't leave him. He shepherded it. And then, of course, a little later, Moses turned.
Yes. And man, don't we know, not just from history, but because of the Israelites, if God hadn't done it this way, there would have been some other, I'm the next high priest. It's supposed to be me. Or, my son is the next high priest. God takes care of that. And Dr. Hurley's right. At the end of Deuteronomy, when Moses dies, it is very public who his successor is to be. There's no dispute. There's no fighting over it or jockeying for it. It's Joshua. This is who it's going to be, right? And so God is gracious in that way. I think Richard was talking about it earlier. He's specific. He's given these very precise commands, and they're to be obeyed this way. And then leave it to chance. One more thing, y'all, before we pray. John.
So from Moses' action when he strikes the rock, I personally take it as an anger, control your anger. Because we, absolute word, Christy and I never argue, but if we were, I would screw up and say words like, you always.
Yeah, right.
So Moses says, must we.
Yes.
And I'm using those as a parallel there. But I think it's controlling your anger is a lesson in there as well. And watching how you exert your anger. Because had he not gone up there in rage, he probably wouldn't have said, must we, and he wouldn't have hit the rock.
And
he probably would have remembered what he was told, too.
Yeah. And in that, right, there's something here for all of us that we need to remember our role and who we are all the time, right? So you might be angry, but you're to, as a father or a mother, right, you in some sense represent God to your children, right? So what kind of representation is that in this kind of anger, right? And in all senses, I know it was a joke, but I actually talked to the youth about this tonight. Everywhere you guys go, you're Christians, representing the Lord, right? And so what does it say? Y'all have heard me use this one before. When you start cussing out the ref at your kid's ball game, and then you invite the other parents to church on Sunday, right? I want you to do that, by the way, but remember who you are when you're doing these things.
You want us to cuss the ref out? Or?
Not that part. Skip that one. I want you to invite them to church. My dad used to always tell us before we'd go on a youth trip, remember who you are and whose you are, right? And that's true for us tonight. John?
One other thing, while we're looking at Moses and what he did do and he didn't get to go to the promised land, he was there during the transfiguration.
Yeah.
That's pretty good exchange, isn't it?
So even though he didn't make it to the promised land, he was standing there with Elijah and Jesus.
Yep. He got to see the better Moses.
Yeah, but you're jumping ahead.
We call this biblical theology. That's right. When Moses goes up on the mountain, right, to see the promised land, that's not the last time he's on a mountain. And he gets to see the better Moses that takes them into the promised land, and you and me there too. Right? Let's end on that. That's excellent. Let's pray, guys. Father, I thank you that you've given us a better Moses because we need one. I thank you that you've not left us alone with no priest to intercede for us. I thank you that our priest, our better Moses and better Aaron, has never sinned and will never sin. I thank you that he died, but he died once and will never die again. I thank you that he continues as our priest forever, that he ever lives to intercede for us. And so, Lord, I ask that you would help us to love him more tonight, to see more deeply and more fully our need of him. And I ask that you would make us more like him. We pray this in Jesus'